Welcome to Optimal Game State. Today, we're going to be looking at the last of the new Cities of Sigmar lists. So previously, we looked at the Castelite Hosts, who have a brand new set of models. Then we looked at Dispossessed, the Dwarves, who don't have Age of Sigmar models, per se, but will feature in the upcoming Old World releases. So they will be getting re-releases of their old models. Now, we're getting to the Darkling Covens at this point, who didn't get any new models for Age of Sigmar and unfortunately aren't going to feature in the Old World. So these models are technically still part of the Cities of Sigmar line of Age of Sigmar, but last I checked they were out of stock. So this one is going to be a little bit tricky to collect. Before we get into the profiles, I thought we would start with a bit of a tour of the background to understand where the Dark Elves fit into the Age of Sigmar. We start in the Old World with Nerion, the first Phoenix King of the High Elves. He was a bit of a badass, but eventually fell in battle. Malekith, Nerion's child with Morathi, was the presumed heir. Now, Malekith was a great warrior and a powerful spellweaver. After Nerion's death, however, the leaders of the High Elves chose another to be the next Phoenix King instead. A little bit more to this, but ultimately this led to a split in the elves into the High Elves of Ulthuan and the Dark Elves who followed Malekith, were mostly Sea Raiders, allied with the Witch Elves who were following Morathi. Moving over to the Age of Sigmar, the old elven gods are gone. Incidentally, Cain was one of them. He was a god of war and murder. They've all been replaced with the heroes from the old world. So Malekith is now named Malerion and is the god of Uglu, the realm of shadow. He is the Shadow King. It was he, along with Astariel, Teclis, and Tyrion, who trapped Slanesh, who had been devouring elvish souls. Morathi is the last piece of the equation. She only recently achieved godhood herself, having been pushing for it for quite a while. There are three factions in Age of Sigmar that are inheritors of the Dark Elf line. The Daughters of Cain are those who follow Morathi. The Shadow Stalkers are those who follow Malerion, and we lastly have the Dark Elves, who are part of the Cities of Sigmar. This is a bit weird. The Daughters of Cain and the Shadow Stalkers do interact and work with the Cities of Sigmar, so in some ways this is mostly just a conceptual difference. Within the Cities of Sigmar, there are again three factions. The Darkling Covens, which are groups of Dark Elves focused around a single sorceress. The Order Serpentis is a line of dragon riders, although now much diminished, they ride Drakespawn instead. Then we have the Scourge Privateers. These are pirates and raiders who roam the seas in the various realms. Despite the name of this warband, all three of these factions are represented. This is essentially the leftovers from the old world. Those Dark Elf models that haven't been reinterpreted into the new Age of Sigmar world. Malerion hasn't been a big feature in the setting yet, although it's only a matter of time before Games Workshop explore him. And when that does happen, I think we're going to see this warband get reinvented, but we're also going to see a bigger focus on the Shadow Elves overall. We can expect a similar thing for Tyrion at some point too, I think. Anyway, on to some profiles. As always, we start with plots. We do have a pretty decent range of points, which is always nice. We have a few cheap models at 55, which is fantastic to see, and the fighters go all the way up to 200. If we do want something chunkier, we can also get it as an ally, so that's fine. I think if we have some solid chaff fighters, a few interesting mid-range models, and some decent abilities, we'll be grand. For chaff, the Corsair seem to have great damage, although average wounds. We do know that these are elves though, so we can expect 5 speed across pretty much everything. So, basically that's going to be the trend. We're expecting high speed, decent average wounds, and hopefully that'll work. On the right hand side, we can see the best damage per points, with the Executioner coming out on top. We can also see that the Assassin is looking pretty good at third place. That's an average of 6.6 damage against T4, which could be interesting, as often with Elven warbands, it's probably going to be a bit of a glass cannon though. At the end, we might look at some blessings to see if that'll help out. There is one ability that everyone in this warband can use. That's the reaction Cutthroat Strike. Now, we've seen abilities like this before. It's basically a better version of the universal reaction Strike Them Down. That was a 4+, but this is a 3+, and that's basically the only change. So it does improve things, but it's only a minor upgrade to an ability that, well, it wasn't regularly used anyway. The first profile to look at is the Sorceress, pretty typical version of the caster. Now, there was a version of this from the old Cities of Sigmar warband, and she's very similar, but she's 15 points cheaper, which is great to see. Despite what I said about elves having low wounds, she is very chunky for 125 points. 18 wounds is about what you'd expect to get for 150. Her melee weapon is weaker than her range weapon, which means that we're just going to keep blasting away at range. Average damage is 3, which means she can do 6 average damage in a turn if she doesn't have to move. Now, that's not quite Demolisher with Flame Hurler, who is the same points but faster and more wounds, but yeah, this is still pretty good. The ability is a quad, so it's going to have to be good. You pick a target and you roll a dice equal to the ability. That's a bad sign already. Quads are pretty hard to get, and needing a good dice value makes that even trickier. The range is also quite tight at only 3 inches. Every 2+ is 3 damage, which is crazy good. So each dice is going to be around 2.5 damage on average. So a Dreamy Quad 6 is going to do 15 damage, ignoring toughness. As a bonus, if that doesn't kill the target, their toughness is half for the rest of the turn. So hopefully the rest of your team can finish the job. I do really like this ability. As always, quads are compared to the move and attack of Rampage, and with a high enough dice value, this could be better. There is an ability on another fighter we'll see a little bit later, which will key off the Sorceress, but it is notable that apart from that, her profile is very similar to the Sinari Caligrave from Lumineth. That fighter has a worse melee profile, not really an issue, and costs 5 points cheaper with a few more useful abilities. Unfortunately, this is going to be a common theme in its warband. The heroes can easily be replaced by allies. The next one to look at is the Assassin, and no special ability at all, so this is all profile. This is remarkably similar to the Skaven Deathmaster, who's 20 points more for 1 extra move and a range attack that, doesn't really matter. I do love the Deathmaster, but there is one problem here. The Deathmaster has a triple running death, which gives it a bonus move so he can get close and then double attack the target. That isn't an option for the Assassin. Points-wise, this is a great profile. You've essentially got that 6 move at the minimal cost of having 3 toughness, which is a great deal. Unfortunately, that's it though. There's really not a lot going here. It's just raw damage and raw numbers. As the Assassin is a hero and doesn't have any synergies with the warband, the sad reality is he can be replaced by any other hero within the Order Grand Lines. For example, the Slaughter Queen from the Daughters of Cain is 5 points cheaper, 1 move slower, but otherwise identical. She then gets an extra abilities, so she gets a double, 2 triples, and a quad. That could be a lot better. The next hero we have is the Lordling, which I think is the cheapest leader that we have in this particular warband. And this is the leader model from the standard troop box. Wounds are decent. We have that great Elven move of 5, and the shield lets it have 4 toughness rather than typical Elven 3. Damage isn't great, but it isn't terrible either. At 100 points, we'd like to have 4 average damage, so 3 with all the other perks isn't too bad. The ability is unique to this fighter. It's similar to the ability in the Castelite warband, which has been quite well received. It will take your bulwark fighters, conveniently the only ones with shields, so you can tell them easily, from 4 toughness to 6 toughness. That's a pretty good number and should make them relatively hardy. It is, of course, limited to just those elves with shields, so it's a little worse than the Castelite version, but still seems pretty solid. As we'll see, the shield troops are really good chaff, so making them a little bit tougher is probably a good thing. The first of those are the Bleak Swords, a mere 55 points. The 8 wounds are good for that, and the average damage of 2 is about right. To go back to the Castelite, this is similar to the Steel Helms, but the Bleak Sword costs 5 less, has 2 less wounds, and is 1 faster. Even better, it's 5 points cheaper than the Flesh Eater Court's new Crypt Ghoul profile, which is identical but has 1 less toughness. Another comparison is with the highly competitive Arcanite Privateers, possibly one of the best chaff fighters in the game. That Privateer is 5 points cheaper, has 4 more wounds and a range attack, which are all bonuses, but is 1 less toughness and only has move 3. So the Bleak Sword is a very different profile. It's faster and has better toughness, while the Arcanite Privateer is able to stay in range and has more wounds. I suspect this is going to come down to what the missions look like. But even compared against a privateer, I think the Bleak Sword is a really solid chat fighter. Again, no abilities to go along with it, but Lordling can buff them up, which hopefully should help. The other option is the Dread Spear, which changes that sword to a spear. Damage drops 1.6, but they get that reach of 2. That's a decent deal. Unless we see a damage boost aura, these guys will typically be used to stand on objectives. It would be nice to have more damage or more wounds, but we're still getting that 5 movement, which, it does make this a pretty good chat fighter. I suspect we're probably going to favor the Bleak Swords for the most part, but, reach can be beneficial. All right, next up we have the Guard Master. Again, this is another leader of a group. In this case, the attacks are split between melee and range, in what basically ends up being an overwhelming fighter. The ability could be interesting. A 666 would be 3 extra dice, effectively a full bonus attack. But as the attack profile is so weak already, it's not really worth it. The Dark Shard is the non-hero version of this fighter. Again, same ability and honestly, same issues. If it was completely focused on the range, maybe it would be good. But yeah, this is just quite expensive for very low damage and really just doesn't get the job done. Like the Sorceress and the Assassin, this Black Ark Fleet Master comes in a single box rather than as part of a unit, although obviously this is linked to the Black Ark Reavers. The Fleet Master is pretty straightforward profile, and honestly is great for the points. Wounds are about 150 worth, and the weapon profile is about right for 135. So we've ended up trading 1 toughness for 1 extra move from the 4/4 baseline, which is a good deal. The special ability, which we will see again and again with the Corsairs, can only be used on the first turn. That often is a move, which in this case will let the Fleet Master move 14 inches for a double, which does seem decent. Obviously, it's not much more than just using Onslaught, but it is something. I think the bonus on the attack is nice and will come into play on some turn ones, but it's not really a big deal. A lot of the time you're just moving position. This is the Corsair box itself. The leader is the Reaver. I'd say he's the one in the funny hat, but that doesn't really narrow it down much. As before, wounds and damage are pretty much what you'd expect for a typical profile at these points. Again, not really much special to say. Same ability as before, it's decent. The main profile for this unit is the Black Orc Corsair with 2 melee weapons. This is 5 points more than the Bleak Swords we saw earlier, and we've traded 1 toughness for an extra 0.6 average damage. We've also lost a Bulwark rune mark, but gained Elite instead, which gets us that turn 1 boost. Now, I suspect the double ability from the Lordling to boost the toughness of the Bleak Swords is going to be more effective than the Merciless Raider double, as that's only going to be boosting 1 fighter at a time. Still, this is a pretty nice profile, and it might be good if you wanted to punch out with a little bit more damage. Then we have the option of trading one of those 2 melee weapons for a range weapon, in this case, a handbow. I think this option could have been interesting, as having lots of chaff with range attacks could let them all target single target and build up the damage, like we have with the Privateer Arcanauts. Unfortunately, the average range damage I do feel is a little bit too low for that to work out, considering the points we're spending. Next up, we have the Blackguard, and starting with the Hero Captain. Wounds are good for the points, damage is just under, and will be more suitable for a 100-point fighter, but we're getting that with Reach 2, which is really good. We're also getting this with 5 speed and 4 toughness, so this overall is a really good profile. There is an ability which any of the Blackguard can use. This is a double which will reduce damage this fighter takes if it's within 3 inches of the Sorceress. So you use the Blackguard to block access to the Sorceress, and then you can have the Sorceress blast away at the back. That's kind of cool. It's a bit tricky to use though. You have to activate the Blackguard and trigger the ability before it'll work. So if your opponent gets to act first, they can get their damage in before you get a chance to use the ability. It also only protects 1 model. So if you have 2 Blackguard and you use the ability with 1, your opponent can just attack the other Blackguard. Add to that we're going to be using this ability with the ranged Sorceress. If your opponent moves into melee with the Blackguard, then the Sorceress can no longer target them with the range attack. So it does look like a good ability, but it could be quite tricky to use. The standard troop is the Blackguard, which is a good chunk cheaper at 85. got 1 average less damage, and wounds go down to 10. Again, great wounds for points, and once you factor in the reach, that damage is pretty good too. These are 30 points more than the Dread Spears, with an increase of 1.4 and 2 wounds. Since there isn't really a difference between the captain of the Blackguard and the normal Blackguard when it comes to the ability, I'd be tempted to normally go with this version instead and then leave the hero slot for something else. This is the same kit, but a different build and a different unit. The Drake Master is the leader of the Executioners. Again, wounds and damage are looking pretty good for what would be a 4 move, 4 toughness unit. But in this case, we're getting that with +1 move for free. The ability is nice. It's a double Executioner Strike, which will increase crit damage. By the averages, you need a 5 or a 6 on your ability to make it better than just Onslaught, but having that option is really nice. The Executioner is similar, just cheaper, and indeed that's a common trend with this warband. Once we get to building a warband, I think we're going to ignore most of the unit leaders, as typically they're just expensive variants without really opening up any additional abilities. Anyway, the Executioner is the best damage per point we have in this warband. It's not by a lot though. Usually 100 points would get you 4 average damage, but we're getting that without making any other sacrifices. Wounds are closer to 80 points than 90, but we do have toughness 4 and speed 5. In this case, a double 3 or 4 will also be better than Onslaught due to lower strength. So, solid fighter, fast with good damage, and no real downsides. And that was the last of the infantry. We have 2 cavalry units left spread across 4 profiles. The first is the classic Dread Knight, leader of the Drakespawn Knight unit. It's a little faster than the rest of the warband at 8 move. It's got 5 toughness, good wounds for 200 points. Damage is a bit low though. The ability is the classic cavalry charge one, which is standard across most warbands. It's nice, but not something you'd ever build a list around. As an aside, I think these used to be called cold ones rather than Drakespawn at some point. I think the suggestion here is that they're somehow related to dragons, but we all know they're velociraptors. These are dinosaurs. The cheaper version is the Drakespawn Knight. Not exactly cheap at 165 points though. It's the same speed and toughness. Wounds are right for the points. Average damage is 1 less at 4, but you do get that with a reach of 2, which is an improvement on the previous one, and makes this a bit of a better value option in my opinion. With many warbands, getting a cavalry option is a way to add speed to the warband, but this warband is already packed with 5 move fighters, so I kind of wonder whether it is actually worth the while. 2 Blackguards, for example, come to 170 points. They have the same combined wounds as the Drakespawn Knight, and are each doing 3 average damage with reach 2. So there definitely is an argument against them. That said, these are Dark Elves riding dinosaurs, and one should never deny oneself the finer things in life. The last unit we have are the Dark Riders, led by the Dark Rider Herald. From what I can tell, the Herald is donated by his pigtails, which are super cute. While the Drakespawn was fast at 8, this is super speedy at 10 move. Toughness here is 4, and wounds are lower, but still matching the points cost. Damage in this case is split across 2 weapons, 1 melee and 1 ranged. Again, having the option is nice, but not so much when the damage isn't great. So the Herald has an ability that boosts range attacks, like we saw with the Dark Shards. As with the Dark Shards though, the range profile is just a little bit too weak to justify using the triple. The normal Dark Rider is 150 points and has the same base profile as the Herald. 10 move, 4 toughness, and wounds matching the 3 wounds per 25 points expectation, pretty much bang on. The damage is a little worse, but the melee attack gains reach, which is nice. They also have a unique ability. This time it is a free disengage as a double, which combined with their reach 2 is really, really good. Direct comparison to the Drakespawn Knights has the Riders 15 points less, losing 2 wounds, losing 1 average damage, but gaining 2 extra move and a range attack as an option. Again, I suspect we aren't going to need all that extra speed with such a fast warband, and it's not like they're really packing much of a punch when they get there. Also, dinosaurs. Why settle for horses when you can have dinosaurs? Before we get into building some warbands, I do want to talk about how the boxes are set up. If you get the Black Watch or the Executioners, you're going to get them in the same box. So if you're looking for either of those, it's the Executioner box. For the Bleak Swords, Dread Spears, or Dark Shards, they are all in the Dread Spears box. And if you want the Dark Riders, you actually get them in the Doomfire Warlocks box, which are part of the Daughters of Cain line. So, You can actually get a decent range of fighter options if you were just to pick up, say, the Executioner and Dread Spear boxes. That would give you, what, 1, 2, 3. Maybe don't play the Dark Shards, but it would give you Black Watch, it would get you Executioners, it would get you Bleak Swords, it would get you Dread Spears, and associated leaders with all of them. That's pretty cool. All right, let's look at some lists. There are very few synergies within this warband. Only 2 real abilities of note. The Blackguard have an ability to take less damage when near a sorceress, and the Lordling has an ability that boosts the toughness of itself and nearby Bleak Swords and Bleak Spears. Those are relatively self-contained. You don't need to do a lot beyond keeping the groups together and triggering abilities. As they're so cheap, I suspect you will be running either the Bleak Swords or Spears, so I'm tempted to favor the Lordling as your default leader. That's going to form a solid core of chaff, and you can make them pretty hard to kill if you need to. The rest of the warband has good profiles that are really competitive numbers, but no particularly exciting abilities. So if you have models like the Corsairs, Executioners, or Drakespawn Knights, you can definitely run them without sacrificing quality, but I'm tempted to say the focus of this warband should be finding a fighter or 2 to ally in. Now, near the start, I did say I wanted to talk a little bit about Divine Blessings with this warband. Everything apart from the Dread Knight has 22 wounds or less, so all the blessings are at the cheaper cost. This warband is remarkably well statted, so we don't need to cover any gaps like we might do with, say, the Dispossessed, who are on move 3. Typically, then, we're going to be looking at getting more damage in. One of the interesting quirks of this warband is that a lot of the fighters have 3 strength. That means a 15-point +1 strength blessing is probably going to give about another 1 average damage increase. That's only going to work if the opposing team has 3 toughness or 4 toughness, though. If they have toughness 5, that would be a complete waste. So instead, you would switch over to the slightly cheaper +1 crit. As you would only be doing damage on 5s and 6s anyway, boosting damage to crit is going to get a lot more value. The extra attack dice will obviously get you more, but it does cost 25 points. So, for example, with this Drakespawn Knight, it would bring the damage to 6.6, 5, 5. So against that T5, it will actually be better, but it'll actually be worse against T4. Since you choose your blessings after the battle plans have been decided, you do have a certain amount of flexibility. Although, do be aware that Divine Blessings are an optional rule, and we have seen tournaments do weird things like making you pick blessings before the event. You also have the option of moving away from blessings that do extra damage and can do stuff like increase the wounds of a fighter that your opponent has a mission to kill or something like that. The Drakespawn Knight is a pretty decent place to start. It's fast and hard to kill already, and that damage boost will give it a little bit more punch. Compared to the Dread Knight, the leader version of it, this normal version with Might is actually doing more damage, has reach, and costs 20 points less. It only really loses out on that 5 wounds, and because there's no abilities that trigger off of the hero rune mark, that doesn't matter. So I think if I was going to be running the Drakespawn Knights, I'd probably go this way. Another option is to try and increase the damage on the Sorceress. Unfortunately, a lot of the blessings are melee only, but Might, the strength one, can increase range damage. So this Might Blessed Sorceress can do 4 damage at range against T4, which is pretty good. If you're planning on using Blackguard as blockers, we could do something like give them +4 wounds with Fortitude. That would make them a bigger buffer to stay alive, assuming you're able to get that combo working. That said, this might be overkill. Taking maybe the 10 wounds is plenty enough to get the job done anyway. As blessings often act as multipliers, they will work better on the more expensive models. Here, we've taken the Assassin and added Brutality to increase his non-crit damage to 3. That's now a 190-point model, but the damage has jumped by almost 2. The model does end up a bit lopsided. The wounds are lower than you expected at this price point, but the damage is higher. Similarly, we can take that super fast Dark Rider and give it a little bit more damage. In this case, the best value is actually increasing the crit damage. So it can move 10, stay at range 2, roll 4 dice, and then you're probably going to be looking for 5s and 6s, and hopefully with a few 6s you can get some crits in. I'm not sure either of these approaches are necessarily good ideas, though. I suspect we're going to be better off going for one of the more classic Order allies for high damage, like Neve or Blood-Racked Medusa, either of which you could then put a blessing on to get even more of a multiplier on. Okay, at this point, I think it's fair to say there is good and bad news for this warband. The chaff for this warband is excellent, and you have options like the Corsairs for a little bit more damage and that early burst of speed. If you do have extra points, you can upgrade those chaff into excellent fighters like the Executioners or the Blackguard. If you love Dark Elves, you can play almost all of your models without making a compromise. That said, if you want to get the most out of this warband, you're probably looking at just a Lordling and Bleak Swords, and maybe one or two powerful allies like Neve. You could, for example, take her a Bloodrack Medusa, a Lordling, and 6 Bleak Swords. That'll probably do really well, but is it really a Dark Elf list? It's essentially the same as having the Castelite Hosts warband and taking a Sergeant at Arms and Steel Helms, but with the Darkling Coven, each model costs 5 points less and is 1 move faster. Your troops do lose 2 wounds, but that's a pretty fair trade. We're also seeing similar lists like that with the Karajan Overlords and their Arcanite Privateers, and it has been incredibly successful. So, it clearly works. Overall, this warband sits in a pretty strange place. If you already have the models, then I think you can have some fun with whatever you have. So, if the objective was to make them playable, then design has succeeded. I think if you could get your hands on the Bleak Sword box, or even the Corsair box, you could make a pretty competitive list using them as a core. But, those boxes are out of stock, and I don't expect to see them be restocked anytime soon. This might put them in a strange place for a competitive play, where they may actually be top tier, but very few people will be able to get their hands on models. That list is also partially dependent on the quality of Order heroes, which hasn't historically been great, but has certainly been improved with the arrival of Neve, and could get better with future releases. Personally, I love the style of the Dark Elves. I do feel that GW maybe have dropped the ball a little bit in fully progressing the style out. But if we can get the models, we can play some games, and we can have some fun. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this look at it. Warband definitely looks playable, potentially highly competitive, depending which route you go down. If you have any experience with this, or if you've got any take that maybe points I've missed, or maybe a profile that I've messed up, please do post in the comments. I would love to hear your feedback, and hopefully someone will be able to take this warband to win a tournament soon enough, and we can get a better idea of what's going on. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Each week I put up a new video talking about one of Games Workshop's specialist games. The goal is always to try and make the best possible 2-player experience. If this is something you'd find interesting, please subscribe to the channel and comment to let me know what you'd like to see in future.